Annihilation of Caste, an undelivered speech, 1936, by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, read by Sagar Arya for Dhamma Audiobooks. Introduction and background. Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, 1891 to 1956, was one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of India. Born into a poor Mahar caste, formerly known as one of the untouchable castes, his natural ability and determination, with some good fortune, enabled him to rise above caste prejudice and become one of the founding fathers of modern India. Following his education in India, he studied law at Columbia University in the US and took a postgraduate degree in economics at the London School of Economics. For thousands of years, Indian society was dominated by the concept of caste, a major element of Hinduism. There are four castes: Brahmin or priestly caste, the Kshatriya or warrior caste, the Vaishya or merchant caste, and Shudra or servant caste. Outside these principal castes were the non-castes, groups of people generally called and regarded as untouchables. There were strict rules on interaction between caste and non-caste people involving touching, eating, intermarrying, etc. There was no opportunity of change. You stayed in the caste into which you were born. It was your duty to engage in the work assigned by religion without demur. Dr. Ambedkar grew up at a time when most members of untouchable castes lived harsh lives doing the worst jobs: night soil collectors, sweepers, and other menial jobs. He was also acutely aware of the severe prejudice with which high caste members viewed the untouchable castes and the severe violence and oppression inflicted on them. It was a social system which had prevailed for thousands of years, imprisoning generation after generation in poverty and misery, and he championed for change throughout his life. Courageously, he used his intellect, his personal high public standing both in India and abroad, and his vision to work towards the outlawing of caste distinction. In 1935, a reforming Hindu movement, the Jat Paat Todak Mandal, Society for the Abolition of the Caste System, invited Dr. Ambedkar to deliver a major speech as president of the Mandal's, the Society's, annual conference in May 1936. He accepted the invitation, wrote the speech, and shortly before the date, sent it to the organizers so that they knew what he would be saying. He realized it was a controversial and uncompromising declaration in its condemnation of the state of caste in Indian society. It proved even too strong for the Jat Paat Todak Mandal itself, which asked him to make minor changes, but characteristically he refused. And as a result, the invitation to speak was withdrawn. Dr. Ambedkar decided to publish his speech, Annihilation of Caste, at his own expense. It created an even greater stir, being made widely available. Mahatma Gandhi, a defender of the caste system, then responded with 2 articles in his magazine Harijan, the patronizing title he gave to the untouchables, Children of God. Sant Ram, leader of the Jat Paat Todak Mandal, then responded to Gandhi. Finally, Dr. Ambedkar himself responded to both. These comments were included in subsequent editions of Annihilation of Caste. Dr. Ambedkar became the Home Minister for India as it worked towards independence from British rule, and he played a major role in devising the Indian Constitution, which included the outlawing of untouchability. However, he eventually concluded that the strong influence of traditional Hinduism and its view on caste would never change society at its deepest level, and he declared that although he was born a Hindu, he would not die a Hindu. It was the only way to release his community from the stigma of untouchability. After decades of studying various world religions, he decided Buddhism was the most rational for the modern world, and particularly appropriate as the Buddha was born in India. On the 14th of October 1956, Dr. Ambedkar, known popularly as Babasaheb, converted to Buddhism at a mass meeting of many thousands of ex-untouchables in Nagpur. Already ill, he died a few weeks later at his home in Delhi on the 6th of December 1956. Annihilation of Caste remains one of the great documents of world political history, along with the Rights of Man and the Communist Manifesto. It is presented here along with the replies from Gandhi and Santram and Dr. Ambedkar's concluding remarks. Today, the term used by ex-untouchables to describe their background is dalit. There are more than 170 million people with a dalit background in India, 16% of the population. Despite the legal protection, many, especially in rural areas, suffer from discrimination, prejudice, and severe violence and perform the degrading, unhealthy and menial work consigned to them over generations. The work of Dr. Ambedkar, remembered with reverence by Dalits today, bettered the lives of millions. But there is still a long way to go to achieve equality. Annihilation of Caste, an Undelivered Speech, 1936, by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Know truth as truth and untruth as untruth. The Buddha. He that will not reason is a bigot. He that cannot reason is a fool. He that dare not reason is a slave. H. Drummond. 1.1 Friends, I am really sorry for the members of the Jat Paat Todak Mandal who have so very kindly invited me to preside over this conference. I am sure they will be asked many questions for having selected me as the president. The Mandal will be asked to explain as to why it has imported a man from Bombay to preside over a function which is held in Lahore. I believe the Mandal could easily have found someone better qualified than myself to preside on the occasion. I have criticized the Hindus. I have questioned the authority of the Mahatma whom they revere. They hate me. To them, I am a snake in their garden. The Mandal will no doubt be asked by the politically minded Hindus to explain why it has called me to fill this place of honor. It is an act of great daring. I shall not be surprised if some political Hindus regard it as an insult. This selection of mine certainly cannot please the ordinary religiously minded Hindus. 1.2 The Mandal may be asked to explain why it has disobeyed the Shastric injunction in selecting the president. According to the Shastras, the Brahman is appointed to be the Guru for the three Varnas. Varnanam Brahmano Garu. Footnote, among Varnas, the Brahman is the teacher/preceptor. End of footnote. Is a direction of the Shastras. Footnote. This refers to the three higher castes, Brahman, Kshatriya and Vaishya, the only castes allowed to study the sacred texts. The fourth caste, Shudras, the servant class, was not allowed to study the sacred texts. End of footnote. The Mandal therefore knows from whom a Hindu should take his lessons and from whom he should not. The Shastras do not permit a Hindu to accept anyone as his guru merely because he is well versed. This is made very clear by Ramdas, a Brahman saint from Maharashtra, who is alleged to have inspired Shivaji to establish a Hindu Raj. In his Das Bodh, a socio-political religious treatise in Marathi verse, Ramdas asks, addressing the Hindus, can we accept an Antyaja, footnote, last born, in this context, untouchable, end of footnote, to be our guru because he is a Pandit, that is learned? He gives an answer in the negative. 1.3 What replies to give to these questions is a matter which I must leave to the Mandal. The Mandal knows best the reasons which led it to travel to Bombay to select a president, to fix upon a man so repugnant to the Hindus, and to descend so low in the scale as to select an Antyaj, an untouchable, to address an audience of the Savarnas, footnote, caste Hindu, end of footnote. As for myself, you will allow me to say that I have accepted the invitation much against my will, and also against the will of many of my fellow untouchables. I know that the Hindus are sick of me. I know that I am not a persona grata with them. Knowing all this, I have deliberately kept myself away from them. I have no desire to inflict myself upon them. I have been giving expression to my views from my own platform. This has already caused a great deal of heartburn and irritation. 1.4. I have no desire to ascend the platform of the Hindus, to do within their sight what I have been doing within their hearing. If I am here, it is because of your choice and not because of my wish. Yours is a cause of social reform. That cause has always made an appeal to me, and it is because of this that I felt I ought not to refuse an opportunity of helping the cause, especially when you think that I can help it. Whether what I am going to say today will help you in any way to solve the problem you are grappling with is for you to judge. All I hope to do is to place before you my views on the problem. 2.1. The path of social reform, like the path to heaven, at any rate in India, is strewn with many difficulties. Social reform in India has few friends and many critics. The critics fall into two distinct classes. One class consists of political reformers and the other of the socialists. 2.2. It was at one time recognized that without social efficiency, no permanent progress in the other fields of activity was possible. That owing to mischief wrought by evil customs, Hindu society was not in a state of efficiency, and that ceaseless efforts must be made to eradicate these evils. It was due to the recognition of this fact that the birth of the National Congress was accompanied by the foundation of the Social Conference. While the Congress was concerned with defining the weak points in the political organization of the country, the Social Conference was engaged in removing the weak points in the social organization of Hindu society. For some time, the Congress and the Conference worked as two wings of one common activity, and they held their annual sessions in the same pandal. 2.3. But soon the two wings developed into two parties, a political reform party and a social reform party, between whom there raged a fierce controversy. The political reform party supported the National Congress, and the social reform party supported the Social Conference. The two bodies thus became two hostile camps. The point at issue was whether social reform should precede political reform. For a decade, the forces were evenly balanced, and the battle was fought without victory to either side. 2.4. It was, however, evident that the fortunes of the Social Conference were ebbing fast. The gentlemen who presided over the sessions of the Social Conference lamented that the majority of the educated Hindus were for political advancement and indifferent to social reform, and that while the number of those who attended the Congress was very large, and the number who did not attend but who sympathized with it was even larger, the number of those who attended the Social Conference was very much smaller. 2.5. This indifference, this thinning of its ranks, was soon followed by active hostility from the politicians. Under the leadership of the late Mr. Tilak, the courtesy with which the Congress allowed the Social Conference the use of its pandal was withdrawn, and the spirit of enmity went to such a pitch that when the Social Conference desired to erect its own pandal, a threat to burn the pandal was held out by its opponents. Thus, in the course of time, the party in favor of political reform won, and the social conference vanished and was forgotten. 2.6. The speech delivered by Mr. W.C. Banerjee in 1892 at Allahabad as President of the 8th session of the Congress sounds like a funeral oration on the death of the social conference, and is so typical of the Congress attitude that I venture to quote from it the following extract. Mr. Banerjee said, "I for one have no patience with those who say we shall not be fit for political reform until we reform our social system. I fail to see any connection between the two. Are we not fit for political reform because our widows remain unmarried and our girls are given in marriage earlier than in other countries? Because our wives and daughters do not drive about with us visiting our friends? Because we do not send our daughters to Oxford and Cambridge?" 2.7. I have stated the case for political reform as put by Mr. Banerjee. There were many who were happy that the victory went to the Congress, but those who believe in the importance of social reform may ask, is an argument such as that of Mr. Banerjee final? Does it prove that the victory went to those who were in the right? Does it prove conclusively that social reform has no bearing on political reform? It will help us to understand the matter if I state the other side of the case. I will draw upon the treatment of the untouchables for my facts. 2.8. Under the rule of the Peshwas in the Maratha country, the untouchable was not allowed to use the public streets if a Hindu was coming along, lest he should pollute the Hindu by his shadow. The untouchable was required to have a black thread either on his wrist or around his neck as a sign or a mark to prevent the Hindus from getting themselves polluted by his touch by mistake. In Pune, the capital of the Peshwa, the untouchable was required to carry, strung from his waist, a broom to sweep away from behind himself the dust he trod on, lest a Hindu walking on the same dust should be polluted. In Pune, the untouchable was required to carry an earthen pot hung around his neck wherever he went for holding his spit, lest his spit falling on the earth should pollute a Hindu who might unknowingly happen to tread on it. 2.9. Let me take more recent facts. The tyranny practiced by the Hindus upon the Balais, an untouchable community in central India, will serve my purpose. You will find a report of this in the Times of India of 4th January 1928. The correspondent of the Times of India reported that high caste Hindus, viz. Kalotas, Rajputs and Brahmins, including the Patels and Patwaris of the villages of Kanaria, Bicholi Hapsi, Bicholi Mardana, and about 15 other villages in Indore district of Indore state, informed the Balais of their respective villages that if they wish to live among them, they must conform to the following rules. 1. Balais must not wear gold lace bordered pagdis. 2. They must not wear dhotis with colored or fancy borders. 3. They must convey intimation of the death of any Hindu to relatives of the deceased, no matter how far away these relatives may be living. 4. In all Hindu marriages, Balais must play music before the processions and during the marriage. 5. Balai women must not wear gold or silver ornaments. They must not wear fancy gowns or jackets. 6. Balai women must attend all cases of confinement of Hindu women. 7. Balais must render services without demanding remuneration and must accept whatever a Hindu is pleased to give. 8. If the Balais do not agree to abide by these terms, they must clear out of the villages. 2.10. The Balais refused to comply, and the Hindu element proceeded against them. Balais were not allowed to get water from the village wells. They were not allowed to let their cattle graze. balais were prohibited from passing through land owned by a Hindu, so that if the field of a balai was surrounded by fields owned by Hindus, the balai could have no access to his own field. The Hindus also let their cattle graze down the fields of the balais. The balais submitted petitions to the Darbar against these persecutions, but as they could get no timely relief and the oppression continued, hundreds of balais with their wives and children were obliged to abandon their homes in which their ancestors had lived for generations and to migrate to adjoining states, that is, to villages in Dhar, Devas, Bagli, Bhopal, Gwalior and other states. What happened to them in their new homes may for the present be left out of our consideration. 2.11. The incident at Kavita in Gujarat happened only last year. The Hindus of Kavita ordered the untouchables not to insist upon sending their children to the common village school maintained by the government. What sufferings the untouchables of Kavita had to undergo for daring to exercise a civic right against the wishes of the Hindus is too well known to need detailed description. Another instance occurred in the village of Zanu in the Ahmedabad district of Gujarat. In November 1935, some untouchable women of well-to-do families started fetching water in metal pots. The Hindus looked upon the use of metal pots by untouchables as an affront to their dignity and assaulted the untouchable women for their impudence. 2.12. A most recent event is reported from the village of Chakwara in Jaipur state. It seems from the reports that have appeared in the newspapers that an untouchable of Chakwara, who had returned from a pilgrimage, had arranged to give a dinner to his fellow untouchables of the village as an act of religious piety. The host desired to treat the guests to a sumptuous meal, and the items served included ghee or butter also. But while the assembly of untouchables was engaged in partaking of the food, the Hindus, in their hundreds, armed with lathis, rushed to the scene, despoiled the food, and belabored the untouchables who left the food and ran for their lives. And why was this murderous assault committed on defenseless untouchables? The reason given is that the untouchable host was impudent enough to serve ghee, and his untouchable guests were foolish enough to taste it. Ghee is undoubtedly a luxury for the rich, but no one would think that consumption of ghee was a mark of high social status. The Hindus of Chakwara thought otherwise, and in righteous indignation avenged themselves for the wrong done to them by the untouchables, who insulted them by treating ghee as an item of their food, which they ought to have known could not be theirs, consistently with the dignity of the Hindus. This means that an untouchable must not use ghee, even if he can afford to buy it, since it is an act of arrogance towards the Hindus. This happened on or about the 1st of April 1936. 2.13. Having stated the facts, let me now state the case for social reform. In doing this, I will follow Mr. Banerjee as nearly as I can and ask the political-minded Hindus, are you fit for political power even though you do not allow a large class of your own countrymen like the untouchables to use public schools? Are you fit for political power even though you do not allow them the use of public wells? Are you fit for political power even though you do not allow them the use of public streets? Are you fit for political power even though you do not allow them to wear what apparel or ornaments they like? Are you fit for political power even though you do not allow them to eat any food they like? I can ask a string of such questions, but these will suffice. 2.14. I wonder what would have been the reply of Mr. Banerjee. I am sure no sensible man will have the courage to give an affirmative answer. Every congressman who repeats the dogma of John Stuart Mill that one country is not fit to rule another country must admit that one class is not fit to rule another class. How is it then that the Social Reform Party lost the battle? To understand this correctly, it is necessary to take note of the kind of social reform which the reformers were agitating for. In this connection, it is necessary to make a distinction between social reform in the sense of the reform of the Hindu family and social reform in the sense of the reorganization and reconstruction of Hindu society. The former has a relation to widow remarriage, child remarriage, etc., while the latter relates to the abolition of the caste system. 2.15. The Social Conference was a body which mainly concerned itself with the reform of the high caste Hindu family. It consisted mostly of enlightened high caste Hindus who did not feel the necessity for agitating for the abolition of caste, or had not the courage to agitate for it. They felt, quite naturally, a greater urge to remove such evils as enforced widowhood, child marriages, etc., evils which prevailed among them and which were personally felt by them. They did not stand up for the reform of Hindu society. The battle that was fought centered round the question of the reform of the family. It did not relate to social reform in the sense of the breakup of the caste system. It was never put in issue by the reformers. That is the reason why the Social Reform Party lost. 2.16. I am aware that this argument cannot alter the fact that political reform did in fact gain precedence over social reform. But the argument has this much value, if not more. It explains why social reformers lost the battle. It also helps us to understand how limited was the victory which the Political Reform Party obtained over the Social Reform Party, and to understand that the view that social reform need not precede political reform is a view which may stand only when by social reform is meant the reform of the family. That political reform cannot with impunity take precedence over social reform in the sense of the reconstruction of society is a thesis which I am sure cannot be controverted. 2.17. That the makers of political constitutions must take account of social forces is a fact which is recognized by no less a person than Ferdinand Lassalle, the friend and co-worker of Karl Marx. In addressing a Prussian audience in 1862, Lassalle said, "The constitutional questions are in the first instance not questions of right, but questions of might." The actual constitution of a country has its existence only in the actual condition of force which exists in the country. Hence, political constitutions have value and permanence only when they accurately express those conditions of forces which exist in practice within a society. 2.18. But it is not necessary to go to Prussia. There is evidence at home. What is the significance of the communal award, with its allocation of political power in defined proportions to diverse classes and communities? In my view, its significance lies in this: that political constitution must take note of social organization. It shows that the politicians who denied that the social problem in India had any bearing on the political problem were forced to reckon with the social problem in devising the constitution. The communal award is, so to say, the nemesis following upon the indifference to and neglect of social reform. It is a victory for the Social Reform Party, which shows that, though defeated, they were in the right in insisting upon the importance of social reform. Many, I know, will not accept this finding. The view is current, and it is pleasant to believe in it, that the communal award is unnatural and that it is the result of an unholy alliance between the minorities and the bureaucracy. I do not wish to rely on the communal award as a piece of evidence to support my contention if it is said that it is not good evidence. 2.19. Let us turn to Ireland. What does the history of Irish Home Rule show? It is well known that in the course of the negotiations between the representatives of Ulster and Southern Ireland, Mr. Redmond, the representative of Southern Ireland, in order to bring Ulster into a home-ruled constitution common to the whole of Ireland, said to the representatives of Ulster, "Ask any political safeguards you like, and you shall have them." What was the reply that Ulstermen gave? Their reply was, "Damn your safeguards, we don't want to be ruled by you on any terms." People who blame the minorities in India ought to consider what would have happened to the political aspirations of the majority if the minorities had taken the attitude which Ulster took. Judged by the attitude of Ulster to Irish Home Rule, is it nothing that the minorities agreed to be ruled by the majority, which has not shown much sense of statesmanship, provided some safeguards were devised for them? But this is only incidental. The main question is, why did Ulster take this attitude? The only answer I can give is that there was a social problem between Ulster and Southern Ireland. The problem between Catholics and Protestants, which is essentially a problem of caste. That home rule in Ireland would be Rome rule was the way in which the Ulstermen had framed their answer. But that is only another way of stating that it was the social problem of caste between the Catholics and the Protestants which prevented the solution of the political problem. This evidence again is sure to be challenged. It will be urged that here too the hand of the imperialist was at work. 2.20. But my resources are not exhausted. I will give evidence from the history of Rome. Here, no one can say that any evil genius was at work. Anyone who has studied the history of Rome will know that the Republican Constitution of Rome bore marks having strong resemblance to the communal award. When the kingship in Rome was abolished, the kingly power or the imperium was divided between the consuls and the Pontifex Maximus. In the consuls was vested the secular authority of the king, while the latter took over the religious authority of the king. This republican constitution had provided that of the two consuls, one was to be patrician and the other plebeian. The same constitution had also provided that of the priests under the Pontifex Maximus, half were to be plebeians and the other half patricians. Why is it that the Republican Constitution of Rome had these provisions which, as I said, resemble so strongly the provisions of the communal award? The only answer one can get is that the Constitution of Republican Rome had to take account of the social division between the patricians and the plebeians who formed two distinct castes. To sum up, let political reformers turn in any direction they like. They will find that in the making of a constitution, they cannot ignore the problem arising out of the prevailing social order. 2.21. The illustrations which I have taken in support of the proposition that social and religious problems have a bearing on political constitutions seem to be too particular. Perhaps they are. But it should not be supposed that the bearing of the one on the other is limited. On the other hand, one can say that, generally speaking, history bears out the proposition that political revolutions have always been preceded by social and religious revolutions. The religious reformation started by Luther was the precursor of the political emancipation of the European people. In England, Puritanism led to the establishment of political liberty. Puritanism founded the New World. It was Puritanism which won the War of American Independence, and Puritanism was a religious movement. 2.22. The same is true of the Muslim Empire. Before the Arabs became a political power, they had undergone a thorough religious revolution started by the Prophet Muhammad. Even Indian history supports the same conclusion, the political revolution led by Chandragupta was preceded by the religious and social revolution of Buddha. The political revolution led by Shivaji was preceded by the religious and social reform brought about by the saints of Maharashtra. The political revolution of the Sikhs was preceded by the religious and social revolution led by Guru Nanak. It is unnecessary to add more illustrations. These will suffice to show that the emancipation of the mind and the soul is a necessary preliminary for the political expansion of 3.1. Let me now turn to the socialists. Can the socialists ignore the problem arising out of the social order? The socialists of India, following their fellows in Europe, are seeking to apply the economic interpretation of history to the facts of India. They propound that man is an economic creature, that his activities and aspirations are bound by economic facts, that property is the only source of power. They therefore preach that political and social reforms are but gigantic illusions, and that economic reform by equalization of property must have precedence over every other kind of reform. One may join issue with every one of these premises, on which rests the socialists' case for economic reform as having priority over every other kind of reform. One may contend that the economic motive is not the only motive by which man is actuated. That economic power is the only kind of power no student of human society can accept. 3.2. That the social status of an individual by itself often becomes a source of power and authority is made clear by the sway which the Mahatmas have held over the common man. Why do millionaires in India obey penniless sadhus and fakirs? Why do millions of paupers in India sell their trifling trinkets which constitute their only wealth and go to Banaras and Mecca? That religion is the source of power is illustrated by the history of India, where the priest holds sway over the common man often greater than that of the magistrate, and where everything, even such things as strikes and elections, so easily takes a religious turn and can so easily be given a religious twist. 3.3. Take the case of the plebeians of Rome as a further illustration of the power of religion over man. It throws great light on this point. The plebeians had fought for a share in the supreme executive under the Roman Republic and had secured the appointment of a plebeian consul elected by a separate electorate constituted by the Comitia Centuriata, which was an assembly of plebeians. They wanted a consul of their own because they felt that the patrician consuls used to discriminate against the plebeians in carrying on the administration. They had apparently obtained a great gain because under the Republican Constitution of Rome, one consul had the power of vetoing an act of the other consul. 3.4. But did they in fact gain anything? The answer to this question must be in the negative. The plebeians never could get a plebeian consul who could be said to be a strong man and who could act independently of the patrician consul. In the ordinary course of things, the plebeians should have got a strong plebeian consul in view of the fact that his election was to be by a separate electorate of plebeians. The question is, why did they fail in getting a strong plebeian to officiate as their consul? 3.5. The answer to this question reveals the dominion which religion exercises over the minds of men. It was an accepted creed of the whole Roman populace that no official could enter upon the duties of his office unless the oracle of Delphi declared that he was acceptable to the goddess. The priests who were in charge of the temple of the goddess of Delphi were all patricians. Whenever, therefore, the plebeians elected a consul who was known to be a strong party man and opposed to the patricians, or communal, to use the term that is current in India, the oracle invariably declared that he was not acceptable to the goddess. This is how the plebeians were cheated out of their rights. 3.6. But what is worthy of note is that the plebeians permitted themselves to be thus cheated because they too, like the patricians, held firmly the belief that the approval of the goddess was a condition precedent to the taking charge by an official of his duties, and that election by the people was not enough. If the plebeians had contended that election was enough and that the approval by the goddess was not necessary, they would have derived the fullest benefit from the political right which they had obtained. But they did not. They agreed to elect another less suitable to themselves but more suitable to the goddess, which in fact meant more amenable to the patricians. Rather than give up religion, the plebeians gave up the material gain for which they had fought so hard. Does this not show that religion can be a source of power as great as money, if not greater? 3.7. The fallacy of the socialists lies in supposing that because in the present stage of European society, property as a source of power is predominant, the same is true of India, or the same was true of Europe in the past. Religion, social status and property are all sources of power and authority which one man has to control the liberty of another. One is predominant at one stage, the other is predominant at another stage. That is the only difference. If liberty is the ideal, and if liberty means the destruction of the dominion which one man holds over another, then obviously it cannot be insisted upon that economic reform must be the one kind of reform worthy of pursuit. If the source of power and dominion is, at any given time or in any given society, social and religious, then social reform and religious reform must be accepted as the necessary sort of reform. 3.8. One can thus attack the doctrine of economic interpretation of history adopted by the socialists of India. But I recognize that the economic interpretation of history is not necessary for the validity of the socialist contention that equalization of property is the only real reform and that it must precede everything else. However, what I would like to ask the socialists is this: can you have economic reform without first bringing about a reform of the social order? The socialists of India do not seem to have considered this question. I do not wish to do them an injustice. I give below a quotation from a letter which a prominent socialist wrote a few days ago to a friend of mine, in which he said, "I do not believe that we can build up a free society in India so long as there is a trace of this ill treatment and suppression of one class by another. Believing as I do in a socialist ideal, inevitably I believe in perfect equality in the treatment of various classes and groups. I think that socialism offers the only true remedy for this as well as other problems." 3.9. Now the question that I would like to ask is it enough for a socialist to say, "I believe in perfect equality in the treatment of the various classes"? To say that such a belief is enough is to disclose a complete lack of understanding of what is involved in socialism. If socialism is a practical program and is not merely an ideal, distant and far off, the question for a socialist is not whether he believes in equality. The question for him is whether he minds one class ill-treating and suppressing another class as a matter of system, as a matter of principle, and thus allow tyranny and oppression to continue to divide one class from another. 3.10. Let me analyze the factors that are involved in the realization of socialism in order to explain fully my point. Now it is obvious that the economic reform contemplated by the socialists cannot come about unless there is a revolution resulting in the seizure of power. That seizure of power must be by a proletariat. The first question I ask is, will the proletariat of India combine to bring about this revolution? What will move men to such an action? It seems to me that, other things being equal, the only thing that will move one man to take such an action is the feeling that other men with whom he is acting are actuated by feelings of equality and fraternity and, above all, of justice. Men will not join in a revolution for the equalization of property unless they know that after the revolution is achieved, they will be treated equally and that there will be no discrimination of caste and creed. 3.11. The assurance of a socialist leading the revolution that he does not believe in caste, I am sure, will not suffice. The assurance must be the assurance proceeding from a much deeper foundation, namely the mental attitude of the compatriots towards one another in their spirit of personal equality and fraternity. Can it be said that the proletariat of India, poor as it is, recognizes no distinctions except that of the rich and the poor? Can it be said that the poor in India recognize no such distinctions of caste or creed, high or low? If the fact is that they do, what unity of front can be expected from such a proletariat in its actions against the rich? How can there be a revolution if the proletariat cannot present a united front? 3.12. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that by some freak of fortune, a revolution does take place and the socialists come into power. Will they not have to deal with the problems created by the particular social order prevalent in India? I can't see how a socialist state in India can function for a second without having to grapple with the problems created by the prejudices which make Indian people observe the distinctions of high and low, clean and unclean. If socialists are not to be content with the mouthing of fine phrases, if the socialists wish to make socialism a definite reality, then they must recognize that the problem of social reform is fundamental and that for them there is no escape from it. 3.13. That the social order prevalent in India is a matter which a socialist must deal with, that unless he does so, he cannot achieve his revolution, and that if he does achieve it as a result of good fortune, he will have to grapple with the social order if he wishes to realize his ideal, is a proposition which, in my opinion, is incontrovertible. He will be compelled to take account of caste after the revolution if he does not take account of it before the revolution. This is only another way of saying that, turn in any direction you like, caste is the monster that crosses your path. You cannot have political reform, you cannot have economic reform unless you kill this monster. 4.1. It is a pity that caste even today has its defenders. The defenses are many. It is defended on the ground that the caste system is but another name for division of labor. And if division of labor is a necessary feature of every civilized society, then it is argued that there is nothing wrong in the caste system. Now, the first thing that is to be urged against this view is that the caste system is not merely a division of labor. It is also a division of laborers. Civilized society undoubtedly needs division of labor. But in no civilized society is division of labor accompanied by this unnatural division of laborers into watertight compartments. The caste system is not merely a division of laborers, which is quite different from the division of labor. It is a hierarchy in which the divisions of laborers are graded one above the other. In no other country is the division of labor accompanied by this gradation of laborers. 4.2. There is also a third point of criticism against this view of the caste system. This division of labor is not spontaneous. It is not based on natural aptitudes. Social and individual efficiency requires us to develop the capacity of an individual to the point of competency to choose and to make his own career. This principle is violated in the caste system, insofar as it involves an attempt to appoint tasks to individuals in advance, selected not on the basis of trained original capacities, but on that of the social status of the parents. 4.3. Looked at from another point of view, this stratification of occupations, which is the result of the caste system, is positively pernicious. Industry is never static. It undergoes rapid and abrupt changes. With such changes, an individual must be free to change his occupation. Without such freedom to adjust himself to changing circumstances, it would be impossible for him to gain his livelihood. Now, the caste system will not allow Hindus to take occupations where they are wanted if they do not belong to them by heredity. If a Hindu is seen to starve rather than to take new occupations not assigned to his caste, the reason is to be found in the caste system. By not permitting readjustment of occupations, caste becomes a direct cause of much of the unemployment we see in the country. 4.4. As a form of division of labor, the caste system suffers from another serious defect. The division of labor brought about by the caste system is not a division based on choice. Individual sentiment, individual preference has no place in it. It is based on the dogma of predestination. Considerations of social efficiency would compel us to recognize that the greatest evil in the industrial system is not so much poverty and the suffering that it involves, as the fact that so many persons have callings which make no appeal to those who are engaged in them. Such callings constantly provoke one to aversion, ill will, and the desire to evade. 4.5. There are many occupations in India which, on account of the fact that they are regarded as degraded by the Hindus, provoke those who are engaged in them to aversion. There is a constant desire to evade and escape from such occupations, which arises solely because of the blighting effect which they produce upon those who follow them, owing to the slight and stigma cast upon them by the Hindu religion. What efficiency can there be in a system under which neither men's hearts nor their minds are in their work? As an economic organization, caste is therefore a harmful institution, inasmuch as it involves the subordination of man's natural powers and inclinations to the exigencies of social rules. 5.1. Some have dug a biological trench in defense of the caste system. It is said that the object of caste was to preserve purity of race and purity of blood. Now, ethnologists are of the opinion that men of pure race exist nowhere, and that there has been a mixture of all races in all parts of the world. Especially is this the case with the people of India. Mr. D.R. Bhandarkar, in his paper on Foreign Elements in the Hindu Population, has stated that there is hardly a class or caste in India which has not a foreign strain in it. There is an admixture of alien blood not only among the warrior classes, the Rajputs and the Marathas, but also among the Brahmins, who are under the happy delusion that they are free from all foreign elements. The caste system cannot be said to have grown as a means of preventing the admixture of races, or as a means of maintaining purity of blood. 5.2. As a matter of fact, the caste system came into being long after the different races of India had commingled in blood and culture. to hold that distinctions of castes are really distinctions of race, and to treat different castes as though there were so many different races, is a gross perversion of facts. What racial affinity is there between the Brahmin of the Punjab and the Brahmin of Madras? What racial affinity is there between the untouchable of Bengal and the untouchable of Madras? What racial difference is there between the Brahmin of the Punjab and the Chamar of the Punjab? What racial difference is there between the Brahmin of Madras and the Pariah of Madras? The Brahmin of the Punjab is racially of the same stock as the Chamar of the Punjab, and the Brahmin of Madras is of the same race as the Pariah of Madras. 5.3. The caste system does not demarcate racial division. The caste system is a social division of people of the same race. Assuming it is, however, to be a case of racial divisions, one may ask, what harm could there be if a mixture of races and of blood was permitted to take place in India by intermarriages between different castes? Men are no doubt divided from animals by so deep a distinction that science recognizes men and animals as two distinct species. But even scientists who believe in purity of races do not assert that the different races constitute different species of men. They are only varieties of one and the same species. As such, they can interbreed and produce an offspring which is capable of breeding and which is not sterile. 5.4. An immense lot of nonsense is talked about heredity and eugenics in defense of the caste system. Few would object to the caste system if it was in accord with the basic principle of eugenics, because few can object to the improvement of the race by judicious mating. But one fails to understand how the caste system secures judicious mating. The caste system is a negative thing. It merely prohibits persons belonging to different castes from intermarrying. It is not a positive method of selecting which two among a given caste should marry. 5.5. If caste is eugenic in origin, then the origin of subcastes must also be eugenic. But can anyone seriously maintain that the origin of subcastes is eugenic? I think it would be absurd to contend for such a proposition, and for a very obvious reason. If caste means race, then differences of subcastes cannot mean differences of race, because subcastes become ex-hypothesized subdivisions of one and the same race. Consequently, the bar against intermarrying and interdining between subcastes cannot be for the purpose of maintaining purity of race or of blood. If subcastes cannot be eugenic in origin, there cannot be any substance in the contention that caste is eugenic in origin. 5.6. Again, if caste is eugenic in origin, one can understand the bar against intermarriage. But what is the purpose of the interdict placed on interdining between castes and subcastes alike? Interdining cannot infect blood, and therefore cannot be the cause either of the improvement or of the deterioration of the race. 5.7. This shows that caste has no scientific origin, and that those who are attempting to give it a eugenic basis are trying to support by science what is grossly unscientific. Even today, eugenics cannot become a practical possibility unless we have definite knowledge regarding the laws of heredity. Professor Bateson, in his Mendel's Principles of Heredity, says, "There is nothing in the descent of the higher mental qualities to suggest that they follow any single system of transmission. It is likely that both they and the more marked developments of physical powers result rather from the coincidence of numerous factors than from the possession of any one genetic element." To argue that the caste system was eugenic in its conception is to attribute to the forefathers of present-day Hindus a knowledge of heredity which even the modern scientists do not possess. 5.8. A tree should be judged by the fruits it yields. If caste is eugenic, what sort of a race of men should it have produced? Physically speaking, the Hindus are a C3 people. They are a race of pygmies and dwarfs, stunted in stature and wanting in stamina. It is a nation 9/10 of which is declared to be unfit for military service. This shows that the caste system does not embody the eugenics of modern scientists. It is a social system which embodies the arrogance and selfishness of a perverse section of the Hindus who were superior enough in social status to set it in fashion and who had the authority to force it on their inferiors. 6.1. Caste does not result in economic efficiency. Caste cannot improve and has not improved race. Caste has, however, done one thing. It has completely disorganized and demoralized the Hindus. 6.2. The first and foremost thing that must be recognized is that Hindu society is a myth. The name Hindu is itself a foreign name. It was given by the Mohammedans to the natives for the purpose of distinguishing themselves. It does not occur in any Sanskrit work prior to the Mohammedan invasion. They did not feel the necessity of a common name because they had no conception of their having constituted a community. Hindu society as such does not exist. It is only a collection of castes. Each caste is conscious of its existence. Its survival is the be-all and end-all of its existence. Castes do not even form a federation. A caste has no feeling that it is affiliated to other castes except when there is a Hindu-Muslim riot. On all other occasions, each caste endeavors to segregate itself and to distinguish itself from other castes. 6.3. Each caste not only dines among itself and marries among itself, but each caste prescribes its own distinctive dress. What other explanation can there be of the innumerable styles of dress worn by the men and women of India, which so amuse the tourists? Indeed, the ideal Hindu must be like a rat living in his own hole, refusing to have any contact with others. There is an utter lack among the Hindus of what the sociologists called consciousness of kind. There is no Hindu consciousness of kind. In every Hindu, the consciousness that exists is the consciousness of his caste. That is the reason why the Hindus cannot be said to form a society or a nation. 6.4. There are, however, many Indians whose patriotism does not permit them to admit that Indians are not a nation, that they are only an amorphous mass of people. They have insisted that underlying the apparent diversity, there is a fundamental unity which marks the life of the Hindus, inasmuch as there is a similarity of those habits and customs, beliefs and thoughts which obtain all over the continent of India. Similarity in habits and customs, beliefs and thoughts there is, but one cannot accept the conclusion that therefore the Hindus constitute a society. To do so is to misunderstand the essentials which go to make up a society. Men do not become a society by living in physical proximity any more than a man ceases to be a member of his society by living so many miles away from other men. 6.5. Secondly, similarity in habits and customs, beliefs and thoughts is not enough to constitute men into society. Things may be passed physically from one to another like bricks. In the same way, habits and customs, beliefs and thoughts of one group may be taken over by another group, and there may thus appear a similarity between the two. Culture spreads by diffusion, and that is why one finds similarity between various primitive tribes in the matter of their habits and customs, beliefs and thoughts, although they do not live in proximity. But no one could say that because there was the similarity, the primitive tribes constituted one society. This is because similarity in certain things is not enough to constitute a society. 6.6. Men constitute a society because they have things which they possess in common. To have similar things is totally different from possessing things in common. And the only way by which men can come to possess things in common with one another is by being in communication with one another. This is merely another way of saying that society continues to exist by communication, indeed, in communication. To make it concrete, it is not enough if men act in a way which agrees with the acts of others. Parallel activity, even if similar, is not sufficient to bind men into a society. 6.7. This is proved by the fact that the festivals observed by the different castes among the Hindus are the same. Yet, these parallel performances of similar festivals by the different castes have not bound them into one integral whole. For that purpose, what is necessary is for a man to share and participate in a common activity, so that the same emotions are aroused in him that animate the others. Making the individual a sharer or partner in the associated activity so that he feels its success as his success, its failure as his failure, is the real thing that binds men and makes a society of them. The caste system prevents common activity, and by preventing common activity, it has prevented the Hindus from becoming a society with a unified life and a consciousness of its own being. 7.1. The Hindus often complain of the isolation and exclusiveness of a gang or a clique and blame them for antisocial spirit. But they conveniently forget that this antisocial spirit is the worst feature of their own caste system. One caste enjoys singing a hymn of hate against another caste as much as the Germans enjoyed singing their hymn of hate against the English during the last war. The literature of the Hindus is full of caste genealogies in which an attempt is made to give a noble origin to one caste and an ignoble origin to other castes. The Sahyadri Khand is a notorious instance of this class of literature. 7.2. This antisocial spirit is not confined to caste alone. It has gone deeper and has poisoned the mutual relations of the subcastes as well. In my province, the Golak Brahmins, Devrukha Brahmins, Karada Brahmins, Palshe Brahmins, and the Chitpavan Brahmins all claim to be subdivisions of the Brahman caste. But the antisocial spirit that prevails between them is quite as marked and quite as virulent as the antisocial spirit that prevails between them and other non-Brahmin castes. There is nothing strange in this. An antisocial spirit is found wherever one group has interests of its own which shut it out from full interaction with other groups, so that its prevailing purpose is protection of what it has got. 7.3. This antisocial spirit, this spirit of protecting their own interests, is as much a marked feature of the different castes in their isolation from one another as it is of nations in their isolation. The Brahman's primary concern is to protect his interests against those of the non-Brahmins, and the non-Brahmins' primary concern is to protect their interests against those of the Brahmins. The Hindus, therefore, are not merely an assortment of castes, but are so many warring groups, each living for itself and for its selfish ideal. 7.4. There is another feature of caste which is deplorable. The ancestors of the present-day English fought on one side or the other in the wars of the Roses and the Cromwellian War. But the descendants of those who fought on the one side do not bear any animosity, any grudge, against the descendants of those who fought on the other side. The feud is forgotten. But the present-day non-Brahmins cannot forgive the present-day Brahmins for the insult their ancestors gave to Shivaji. The present-day Kayasts will not forgive the present-day Brahmins for the infamy cast upon their forefathers by the forefathers of the latter. To what is this difference due? Obviously to the caste system. The existence of caste and caste consciousness has served to keep the memory of past feuds between castes green and has prevented solidarity. 8.1. The recent discussion about the excluded and partially excluded areas has served to draw attention to the position of what are called the Aboriginal tribes in India. They number about 13 million, if not more. Apart from the question of whether their exclusion from the new constitution is proper or improper, the fact still remains that these Aborigines have remained in their primitive, uncivilized state in a land which boasts of a civilization thousands of years old. Not only are they not civilized, but some of them follow pursuits which have led to their being classified as criminals. 8.2. 13 million people living in the midst of civilization are still in a savage state and are leading the life of hereditary criminals. But the Hindus have never felt ashamed of it. This is a phenomenon which, in my view, is quite unparalleled. What is the cause of this shameful state of affairs? Why has no attempt been made to civilize these Aborigines and to lead them to take to a more honorable way of making a living? 8.3. The Hindus will probably seek to account for this savage state of the Aborigines by attributing to them congenital stupidity. They will probably not admit that the Aborigines have remained savages because they had made no effort to civilize them, to give them medical aid, to reform them, to make them good citizens. But supposing a Hindu wished to do what the Christian missionary is doing for these Aborigines, could he have done it? I submit not. Civilizing the Aborigines means adopting them as your own, living in their midst and cultivating fellow feeling. In short, loving them. How is it possible for a Hindu to do this? His whole life is one anxious effort to preserve his caste. Caste is his precious possession, which he must save at any cost. He cannot consent to lose it by establishing contact with the Aborigines, the remnants of the hateful Anaryas of the Vedic days. 8.4. Not that a Hindu could not be taught the sense of duty to fallen humanity, but the trouble is that no amount of sense of duty can enable him to overcome his duty to preserve his caste. Caste is, therefore, the real explanation as to why the Hindu has let the savage remain a savage in the midst of his civilization without blushing or without feeling any sense of remorse or repentance. The Hindu has not realized that these Aborigines are a source of potential danger. If these savages remain savages, they may not do any harm to the Hindus. But if they are reclaimed by non-Hindus and converted to their faiths, they will swell the ranks of the enemies of the Hindus. If this happens, the Hindu will have to thank himself and his caste system. 9.1. Not only has the Hindu made no effort for the humanitarian cause of civilizing the savages, but the higher caste Hindus have deliberately prevented the lower castes who are within the pale of Hinduism from rising to the cultural level of the higher castes. I will give two instances. One of the Sonars and the other of the Pathare Prabhus. Both are communities quite well known in Maharashtra. Like the rest of the communities desiring to raise their status, these two communities were at one time endeavoring to adopt some of the ways and habits of the Brahmins. 9.2. The Sonars were styling themselves Daivadnya Brahmins and were wearing their dhotis with folds in them and using the word Namaskar for salutation. Both the folded way of wearing the dhoti and the Namaskar were special to the Brahmins. The Brahmins did not like this imitation and this attempt by Sonars to pass off as Brahmins. Under the authority of the Peshwas, the Brahmins successfully put down this attempt on the part of the Sonars to adopt the ways of the Brahmins. They even got the president of the councils of the East India Company's settlement in Bombay to issue a prohibitory order against the Sonars residing in Bombay. 9.3. At one time, the Pathare Prabhus had widow remarriage as a custom of their caste. This custom of widow remarriage was later on looked upon as a mark of social inferiority by some members of the caste, especially because it was contrary to the custom prevalent among the Brahmins. With the object of raising the status of their community, some Pathare Prabhus sought to stop this practice of widow remarriage that was prevalent in their caste. The community was divided into two camps, one for and the other against the innovation. The Peshwas took the side of those in favor of widow remarriage and thus virtually prohibited the Pathare Prabhus from following the ways of the Brahmins. 9.4. The Hindus criticized the Mohammedans for having spread their religion by the use of the sword. They also ridiculed Christianity on the score of the Inquisition. But really speaking, who is better and more worthy of our respect? The Mohammedans and Christians who attempted to thrust down the throats of unwilling persons what they regarded as necessary for their salvation? Or the Hindu who would not spread the light, who would endeavor to keep others in darkness, who would not consent to share his intellectual and social inheritance with those who are ready and willing to make it part of their own makeup? I have no hesitation in saying that if the Mohammedan has been cruel, the Hindu has been mean, and meanness is worse than cruelty. 10.1. Whether the Hindu religion was or was not a missionary religion has been a controversial issue. Some hold the view that it was never a missionary religion. Others hold that it was. That the Hindu religion was once a missionary religion must be admitted. It could not have spread over the face of India if it was not a missionary religion. That today it is not a missionary religion is also a fact which must be accepted. The question, therefore, is not whether or not the Hindu religion was a missionary religion. The real question is, why did the Hindu religion cease to be a missionary religion? 10.2. My answer is this. The Hindu religion ceased to be a missionary religion when the caste system grew up among the Hindus. Caste is inconsistent with conversion. Inculcation of beliefs and dogmas is not the only problem that is involved in conversion. To find a place for the convert in the social life of the community is another and a much more important problem that arises in connection with conversion. The problem is where to place the convert in what caste. It is a problem which must baffle every Hindu wishing to make aliens convert to his religion. 10.3. Unlike a club, the membership of a caste is not open to all and sundry. The law of caste confines its membership to persons born in the caste. Castes are autonomous, and there is no authority anywhere to compel a caste to admit a newcomer to its social life. Hindu society being a collection of castes and each caste being a closed corporation, there is no place for a convert. Thus, it is caste which has prevented the Hindus from expanding and from absorbing other religious communities, So long as caste remains, Hindu religion cannot be made a missionary religion, and Shuddhi, purification, will be both a folly and a futility. 11.1 The reasons which have made Shuddhi impossible for Hindus are also responsible for making Sangathan, a unifying Hindu movement, impossible. The idea underlying Sangathan is to remove from the mind of the Hindu that timidity and cowardice which so painfully mark him off from the Mohammedan and the Sikh, and which have led him to adopt the low ways of treachery and cunning for protecting himself. The question naturally arises, from where does the Sikh or the Mohammedan derive his strength, which makes him brave and fearless? I am sure it is not due to relative superiority of physical strength, diet, or drill. It is due to the strength arising out of the feeling that all Sikhs will come to the rescue of a Sikh when he is in danger, and that all Mohammedans will rush to save a Muslim if he is attacked. 11.2 The Hindu can derive no such strength. He cannot feel assured that his fellows will come to his help. Being one and fated to be alone, he remains powerless, develops timidity and cowardice, and in a fight surrenders or runs away. The Sikh, as well as the Muslim, stands fearless and gives battle, because he knows that though one, he will not be alone. The presence of this belief in the one helps him to hold out, and the absence of it in the other makes him to give way. 11.3 If you pursue this matter further and ask what is it that enables the Sikh and the Mohammedan to feel so assured, and why is it that the Hindu filled with such despair in the matter of help and assistance, you will find that the reasons for this difference lie in the difference in their associated mode of living. The associated mode of life practiced by the Sikhs and the Mohammedans produces fellow feeling. The associated mode of life of the Hindus does not. Among Sikhs and Muslims, there is a social cement which makes them bhais or brothers. Among Hindus, there is no such cement, and one Hindu does not regard another Hindu as his bhai. This explains why a Sikh says and feels that one Sikh or one Khalsa is equal to Sawa Lakh or 125,000 men. This explains why one Mohammedan is equal to a crowd of Hindus. This difference is undoubtedly a difference due to caste. So long as caste remains, there will be no Sangathan. And so long as there is no Sangathan, the Hindu will remain weak and meek. 11.4 The Hindus claim to be a very tolerant people. In my opinion, this is a mistake. On many occasions, they can be intolerant. And if on some occasions they are tolerant, that is because they are too weak to oppose or too indifferent to oppose. This indifference of the Hindus has become so much part of their nature that a Hindu will quite meekly tolerate an insult as well as a wrong. You see amongst them, to use the words of Morris, the great treading down the little, the strong beating down the weak, cruel men fearing not, kind men daring not, and wise men caring not. With the Hindu gods all forbearing, it is not difficult to imagine the pitiable condition of the wronged and the oppressed among the Hindus. Indifferentism is the worst kind of disease that can infect a people. Why is the Hindu so indifferent? In my opinion, this indifferentism is the result of the caste system, which has made Sangathan and cooperation, even for a good cause, impossible. 12.1 The assertion by the individual of his own opinions and beliefs, his own independence and interest over and against group standards, group authority and group interests is the beginning of all reform. But whether the reform will continue depends upon what scope the group affords for such individual assertion. If the group is tolerant and fair-minded in dealing with such individuals, they will continue to assert, and in the end will succeed in converting their fellows. On the other hand, if the group is intolerant and does not bother about the means it adopts to stifle such individuals, they will perish and the reform will die out. 12.2. Now a caste has an unquestioned right to excommunicate any man who is guilty of breaking the rules of the caste. And when it is realized that excommunication involves a complete cessor of social intercourse, it will be agreed that as a form of punishment, there is really little to choose between excommunication and death. No wonder individual Hindus have not had the courage to assert their independence by breaking the barriers of caste. 12.3. It is true that man cannot get on with his fellows, but it is also true that he cannot do without them. He would like to have the society of his fellows on his own terms. If he cannot get it on his terms, then he will be ready to have it on any terms, even amounting to complete surrender. This is because he cannot do without society. A caste is ever ready to take advantage of the helplessness of a man and to insist upon complete conformity to its code in letter and in spirit. 12.4. A caste can easily organize itself into a conspiracy to make the life of a reformer hell. And if a conspiracy is a crime, I do not understand why such a nefarious act as an attempt to excommunicate a person for daring to act contrary to the rules of caste should not be made an offense punishable by law. But as it is, even law gives each caste autonomy to regulate its membership and punish dissenters with excommunication. Caste in the hands of the orthodox has been a powerful weapon for persecuting the reformers and for killing all reform. 13.1. The effect of caste on the ethics of the Hindus is simply deplorable. Caste has killed public spirit. Caste has destroyed the sense of public charity. Caste has made public opinion impossible. A Hindu's public is his caste. His responsibility is only to his caste. His loyalty is restricted only to his caste. Virtue has become caste-ridden and morality has become caste-bound. There is no sympathy for the deserving. There is no appreciation of the meritorious. There is no charity to the needy. Suffering as such calls for no response. There is charity, but it begins with caste and ends with caste. There is sympathy, but not for men of other castes. 13.2. Would a Hindu acknowledge and follow the leadership of a great and good man? The case of a Mahatma apart, the answer must be that he will follow a leader if he is a man of his caste. A Brahmin will follow a leader only if he is a Brahmin. A Kayasth if he is a Kayasth, and so on. The capacity to appreciate merits in a man, apart from his caste, does not exist in a Hindu. There is appreciation of virtue, but only when the man is a fellow caste man. The whole morality is as bad as tribal morality. My caste man, right or wrong. My caste man, good or bad. It is not a case of standing by virtue or not standing by vice. It is a case of standing by or not standing by caste. Have not Hindus committed treason against their country in the interest of their castes? 14.1. I would not be surprised if some of you have grown weary listening to this tiresome tale of the sad effects which caste has produced. There is nothing new in it. I will therefore turn to the constructive side of the problem. What is your ideal society if you do not want caste is a question that is bound to be asked of you. If you ask me, My ideal would be a society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. And why not? 14.2. What objection can there be to fraternity? I cannot imagine any. An ideal society should be mobile, should be full of channels for conveying a change taking place in one part to other parts. In an ideal society, there should be many interests consciously communicated and shared. There should be varied and free points of contact with other modes of association. In other words, there must be social endosmosis. This is fraternity, which is only another name for democracy. Democracy is not merely a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men. 14.3. Any objection to liberty? Few object to liberty in the sense of a right to free movement, in the sense of a right to life and limb. There is no objection to liberty in the sense of a right to property, tools and materials as being necessary for earning a living, to keep the body in a due state of health. Why not allow a person the liberty to benefit from an effective and competent use of a person's powers? The supporters of caste, who would allow liberty in the sense of a right to life, limb and property, would not readily consent to liberty in this sense, inasmuch as it involves liberty to choose one's profession. 14.4. But to object to this kind of liberty is to perpetuate slavery. For slavery does not merely mean a legalized form of subjection. It means a state of society in which some men are forced to accept from others the purposes which control their conduct. This condition obtains even where there is no slavery in the legal sense. It is found where, as in the caste system, some persons are compelled to carry on certain prescribed callings which are not of their choice. 14.5. Any objection to equality? This has obviously been the most contentious part of the slogan of the French Revolution. The objections to equality may be sound, and one may have to admit that all men are not equal, but what of that? Equality may be a fiction, but nonetheless, one must accept it as the governing principle. A man's power is dependent upon 1. Physical heredity, 2. Social inheritance or endowment in the form of parental care, education, accumulation of scientific knowledge, everything which enables him to be more efficient than the savage, and finally, 3. On his own efforts. In all these 3 respects, men are undoubtedly unequal, but the question is, shall we treat them as unequal because they are unequal? This is a question which the opponents of equality must answer. 14.6. From the standpoint of the individualist, it may be just to treat men unequally so far as their efforts are unequal. It may be desirable to give as much incentive as possible to the full development of everyone's powers. But what would happen if men were treated as unequally as they are unequal in the first 2 respects? It is obvious that those individuals also in whose favor there is birth, education, family name, business connections, and inherited wealth would be selected in the race. But selection under such circumstances would not be a selection of the able. It would be the selection of the privileged. The reason, therefore, which forces that in the 3rd respect we should treat men unequally, demands that in the first 2 respects we should treat men as equally as possible. 14.7. On the other hand, it can be urged that if it is good for the social body to get the most out of its members, it can get the most out of them only by making them equal as far as possible at the very start of the race. That is one reason why we cannot escape equality. But there's another reason why we must accept equality. A statesman is concerned with vast numbers of people. He has neither the time nor the knowledge to draw fine distinctions and to treat each one equitably, that is, according to need or according to capacity. However desirable or reasonable an equitable treatment of men may be, humanity is not capable of assortment and classification. The statesman, therefore, must follow some rough and ready rule, and that rough and ready rule is to treat all men alike, not because they are alike, but because classification and assortment is impossible. The doctrine of equality is glaringly fallacious, but, taking all in all, it is the only way a statesman can proceed in politics, which is a severely practical affair and which demands a severely practical test. 15.1. But there is a set of reformers who hold out a different ideal. They go by the name of the Arya Samajists, and their ideal of social organization is what is called Chaturvarnya, or the division of society into 4 classes instead of the 4,000 castes that we have in India. To make it more attractive and to disarm opposition, the protagonists of Chaturvarnya take great care to point out that their Chaturvarnya is based not on birth, but on guna, worth. At the outset, I must confess that notwithstanding the worth basis of this Chaturvarnya, it is an ideal to which I cannot reconcile myself. 15.2. In the first place, if under the Chaturvarnya of the Arya Samajists, an individual is to take his place in Hindu society according to his worth, I do not understand why the Arya Samajists insist on labeling men as Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. A learned man would be honored without his being labeled a Brahman. A soldier would be respected without his being designated a Kshatriya. If European society honors its soldiers and its servants without giving them permanent labels, why should Hindu society find it difficult to do so? Is a question which Arya Samajists have not cared to consider. 15.3. There is another objection to the continuance of these labels. All reform consists in a change in the notions, sentiments, and mental attitudes of the people towards men and things. It is common experience that certain names become associated with certain notions and sentiments, which determine a person's attitude towards men and things. The names Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra are names which are associated with a definite and fixed notion in the mind of every Hindu. That notion is that of a hierarchy based on birth. 15.4. So long as these names continue, Hindus will continue to think of the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra as hierarchical divisions of high and low based on birth and to act accordingly. The Hindu must be made to unlearn all this. But how can this happen if the old labels remain and continue to recall to his mind old notions? If new notions are to be inculcated in the minds of people, it is necessary to give them new names. To continue the old names is to make the reform futile. To allow this Chaturvarnya based on worth to be designated by such stinking labels as Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, indicative of social divisions based on birth, is a snare. 16.1. To me, this Chaturvarnya with its old labels is utterly repellent, and my whole being rebels against it. But I do not wish to rest my objection to Chaturvarnya on mere grounds of sentiments. There are more solid grounds on which I rely for my opposition to it. A close examination of this ideal has convinced me that as a system of social organization, Chaturvarnya is impracticable, is harmful, and has turned out to be a miserable failure. From a practical point of view, the system of Chaturvarnya raises several difficulties which its protagonists do not seem to have taken into account. The principle underlying caste is fundamentally different from the principle underlying Chaturvarnya. Not only are they fundamentally different, but they are also fundamentally opposed. 16.2. The former, Chaturvarnya, is based on worth. How are you going to compel people who have acquired a higher status based on birth without reference to their worth to vacate that status? How are you going to compel people to recognize the status due to a man in accordance with his worth, who is occupying a lower status based on his birth? For this, you must first break up the caste system in order to be able to establish the Chaturvarnya system. How are you going to reduce the 4,000 castes based on birth to the 4 Varnas based on worth? This is the first difficulty which the protagonists of Chaturvarnya must grapple with. 16.3. There is a second difficulty which the protagonists of Chaturvarnya must grapple with if they wish to make the establishment of Chaturvarnya a success. Chaturvarnya presupposes that you can classify people into 4 definite classes. Is this possible? In this respect, the ideal of Chaturvarnya has, as you will see, a close affinity to the Platonic ideal. To Plato, men fell by nature into 3 classes. In some individuals, he believed, mere appetites dominated. He assigned them to the laboring and trading classes. Others revealed to him that over and above appetites, they had a courageous disposition. He classed them as defenders in war and guardians of internal peace. Others showed a capacity to grasp the universal, the reason underlying things. He made them the lawgivers of the people. 16.4. The criticism to which Plato's Republic is subject is also the criticism which must apply to the system of Chaturvarnya, insofar as it proceeds upon the possibility of an accurate classification of men into 4 distinct classes. The chief criticism against Plato is that his idea of lumping individuals into a few sharply marked off classes is a very superficial view of man and his powers. Plato had no perception of the uniqueness of every individual, of his incommensurability with others, of each individual as forming a class of his own. He had no recognition of the infinite diversity of active tendencies and the combination of tendencies of which an individual is capable. To him, there were types of faculties or powers in the individual constitution. 16.5. All this is demonstrably wrong. Modern science has shown that the lumping together of individuals into a few sharply marked off classes is a superficial view of man, not worthy of serious consideration. Consequently, the utilization of the qualities of individuals is incompatible with their stratification by classes, since the qualities of individuals are so variable. Chaturvarnya must fail for the very reason for which Plato's Republic must fail, namely, that it is not possible to pigeon men into holes according to class. That it is impossible to accurately classify people into 4 definite classes is proved by the fact that the original 4 classes have now become 4,000 castes. 16.6. There is a third difficulty in the way of the establishment of the system of Chaturvarnya. How are you going to maintain the system of Chaturvarnya, supposing it was established? One important requirement for the successful working of Chaturvarnya is the maintenance of the penal system which could maintain it by its sanction. The system of Chaturvarnya must perpetually face the problem of the transgressor. Unless there is a penalty attached to the act of transgression, men will not keep to their respective classes. The whole system will break down, being contrary to human nature. Chaturvarnya cannot subsist by its own inherent goodness. It must be enforced by law. 16.7. That without penal sanction the ideal of Chaturvarnya cannot be realized is proved by the story in the Ramayana of Rama killing Shambhuka. Some people seem to blame Rama because he wantonly and without reason killed Shambhuka. But to blame Rama for killing Shambhuka is to misunderstand the whole situation. Ram Raj was a Raj based on Chaturvarnya. As a king, Rama was bound to maintain Chaturvarnya. It was his duty, therefore, to kill Shambhuka, the Shudra, who had transgressed his class and wanted to be a Brahmin. This is the reason why Rama killed Shambhuka. But this also shows that penal sanction is necessary for the maintenance of Chaturvarnya. Not only penal sanction is necessary, but the penalty of death is necessary. That is why Rama did not inflict on Shambhuka a lesser punishment. That is why the Manusmriti prescribes such heavy sentences as cutting off the tongue or pouring of molten lead in the ears of the Shudra who recites or hears the Veda. The supporters of Chaturvarnya must give an assurance that they could successfully classify men and that they could induce modern society in the 20th century to reforge the penal sanctions of the Manusmriti. 16.8. The protagonists of Chaturvarnya do not seem to have considered what is to happen to women in their system. Are they also to be divided into 4 classes? Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra? Or are they to be allowed to take the status of their husbands? If the status of the woman is to be the consequence of marriage, what becomes of the underlying principle of Chaturvarnya, namely, that the status of a person should be based upon the worth of that person? If they are to be classified according to their worth, is their classification to be nominal or real? 16.9. If it is to be nominal, then it is useless. And then the protagonists of Chaturvarnya must admit that their system does not apply to women. If it is real, are the protagonists of Chaturvarnya prepared to follow the logical consequences of applying it to women? They must be prepared to have women priests and women soldiers. Hindu society has grown accustomed to women teachers and women barristers. It may grow accustomed to women brewers and women butchers. But he would be a bold person who would say that it will allow women priests and women soldiers. But that will be the logical outcome of applying Chaturvarnya to women. Given these difficulties, I think no one except a congenital idiot could hope for and believe in a successful regeneration of Chaturvarnya. 17.1. Assuming that Chaturvarnya is practicable, I contend that it is the most vicious system, that the Brahmins should cultivate knowledge, that the Kshatriya should bear arms, that the Vaishya should trade and that the Shudra should serve sounds as though it was a system of division of labor. Whether the theory was intended to state that the Shudra need not, or whether it was intended to lay down that he must not, is an interesting question. The defenders of Chaturvarnya give it the first meaning. They say, why need the Shudra trouble to acquire wealth when the higher 3 Varnas are there to support him? Why need the Shudra bother to take to education when there is the Brahman to whom he can go when the occasion for reading or writing arises? Why need the Shudra worry to arm himself when there is the Kshatriya to protect him? The theory of Chaturvarnya, understood in this sense, may be said to look upon the Shudra as the ward and the three higher Varnas as his guardians. Thus interpreted, it is a simple, elevating and alluring theory. 17.2. Assuming this to be the correct view of the underlying conception of Chaturvarnya, it seems to me that the system is neither foolproof nor knave-proof. What is to happen if the Brahmins, Vaishyas and Kshatriyas fail to pursue knowledge, to engage in economic enterprise, and to be efficient soldiers, which are their respective functions? Contrariwise, suppose that they discharge their functions, but flout their duty to the Shudra or to one another. What is to happen to the Shudra if the three classes refuse to support him on fair terms, or combine to keep him down? Who is to safeguard the interests of the Shudra, or for that matter, those of the Vaishya and Kshatriya, when the person who is trying to take advantage of his ignorance is the Brahmin? Who is to defend the liberty of the Shudra, and for that matter, of the Brahmin and the Vaishya, when the person who is robbing him of it is the Kshatriya? 17.3. Interdependence of one class on another is inevitable. Even dependence of one class upon another may sometimes become allowable. But why make one person depend on another in the matter of his vital needs? Education everyone must have. Means of defense everyone must have. These are the paramount requirements of every man for his self-preservation. How can the fact that his neighbor is educated and armed help a man who is uneducated and disarmed? The whole theory is absurd. These are the questions which the defenders of Chaturvarnya do not seem to be troubled about. But they are very pertinent questions. Assuming that in their conception of Chaturvarnya, the relationship between the different classes is that of ward and guardian, and that this is the real conception underlying Chaturvarnya, it must be admitted that it makes no provision to safeguard the interests of the ward from the misdeeds of the guardian. 17.4. Whether or not the relationship of guardian and ward was the real underlying conception on which Chaturvarnya was based, there is no doubt that in practice, the relation was that of master and servants. The three classes, Brahmins, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas, although not very happy in their mutual relationship, managed to work by compromise. The Brahmin flattered the Kshatriya, and both let the Vaishya live in order to be able to live upon him. But the three agreed to beat down the Shudra. He was not allowed to acquire wealth, lest he should be independent of the three Varnas. He was prohibited from acquiring knowledge, lest he should keep a steady vigil regarding his interests. He was prohibited from bearing arms, lest he should have the means to rebel against their authority. That this is how the Shudras were treated by the Triyavarnikas, the three Varnas, is evidenced by the laws of Manu. There is no code of laws more infamous regarding social rights than the laws of Manu. Any instance from anywhere of social injustice must pale before it. 17.5. Why have the mass of people tolerated the social evils to which they have been subjected? There have been social revolutions in other countries of the world. Why have there not been social revolutions in India is a question which has incessantly troubled me. There is only one answer which I can give, and it is that the lower classes of Hindus have been completely disabled for direct action on account of this wretched caste system. They could not bear arms, and without arms they could not rebel. They were all ploughmen, or rather condemned to be ploughmen, and they never were allowed to convert their ploughshares into swords. They had no bayonets, and therefore everyone who chose could and did sit upon them. On account of the caste system, they could receive no education. They could not think out or know the way to their salvation. They were condemned to be lowly, and not knowing the way of escape and not having the means of escape, they became reconciled to eternal servitude, which they accepted as their inescapable fate. 17.6. It is true that even in Europe, the strong have not shrunk from the exploitation, nay, the spoliation of the weak. But in Europe, the strong have never contrived to make the weak helpless against exploitation so shamelessly as was the case in India among the Hindus. Social war has been raging between the strong and the weak far more violently in Europe than it has ever been in India. Yet, the weak in Europe has had in his freedom of military service his physical weapon, in suffering his political weapon, and in education his moral weapon. These three weapons for emancipation were never withheld by the strong from the weak in Europe. All these weapons were, however, denied to the masses in India by the caste system. 17.7. There cannot be a more degrading system of social organization than the caste system. It is the system which deadens, paralyzes, and cripples the people from helpful activity. This is no exaggeration. History bears ample evidence. There is only one period in Indian history which is a period of freedom, greatness, and glory. That is the period of the Maurya Empire. At all other times, the country suffered from defeat and darkness. But the Maurya period was a period when the caste system was completely annihilated, when the Shudras, who constituted the mass of the people, came into their own and became the rulers of the country. The period of defeat and darkness is the period when the caste system flourished, to the damnation of the greater part of the people of the country. 18. 18.1. Chaturvarnya is not new. It is as old as the Vedas. That is one of the reasons why we are asked by the Arya Samajists to consider its claims. Judging from the past, as a system of social organization, it has been tried and it has failed. How many times have the Brahmins annihilated the seed of the Kshatriyas? How many times have the Kshatriyas annihilated the Brahmins? The Mahabharata and the Puranas are full of incidents of the strife between the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. They even quarreled over such petty questions as to who should salute first, as to who should give way first, the Brahmins or the Kshatriyas, when the two met in the street. 18.2. Not only was the Brahmin an eyesore to the Kshatriya and the Kshatriya an eyesore to the Brahmin, it seems that the Kshatriyas had become tyrannical and the masses, disarmed as they were under the system of Chaturvarnya, were praying to Almighty God for relief from their tyranny. The Bhagavad tells us very definitely that Krishna had taken avatar for one sacred purpose, and that was to annihilate the Kshatriyas. With these instances of rivalry and enmity between the different Varnas before us, I do not understand how anyone can hold out Chaturvarnya as an ideal to be aimed at, or as a pattern on which Hindu society should be remodeled. 19. 19.1. I have dealt with those who are without you, and whose hostility to your ideal is quite open. There appear to be others who are neither without you nor with you. I was hesitating whether I should deal with their point of view. But on further consideration, I have come to the conclusion that I must, and that for two reasons. Firstly, their attitude to the problem of caste is not merely an attitude of neutrality, but is an attitude of armed neutrality. Secondly, they probably represent a considerable body of people. Of these, there is one sect which finds nothing peculiar or odious in the caste system of the Hindus. Such Hindus cite the case of Muslims, Sikhs and Christians and find comfort in the fact that they too have castes amongst them. 19.2. In considering this question, you must at the outset bear in mind that nowhere is human society one single whole. It is always plural. In the world of action, the individual is one limit and society the other. Between them lie all sorts of associative arrangements of lesser and larger scope: families, friendships, cooperative associations, business combines, political parties, bands of thieves and robbers. These small groups are usually firmly welded together and are often as exclusive as castes. They have a narrow and intensive code, which is often antisocial. This is true of every society in Europe as well as in Asia. The question to be asked in determining whether a given society is an ideal society is not whether there are groups in it, because groups exist in all societies. 19.3. The questions to be asked in determining what is an ideal society are: how numerous and varied are the interests which are consciously shared by the groups? How full and free is the interplay with other forms of associations? Are the forces that separate groups and classes more numerous than the forces that unite them? What social significance is attached to this group life? Is its exclusiveness a matter of custom and convenience, or is it a matter of religion? It is in the light of these questions that one must decide whether caste among non-Hindus is the same as caste among Hindus. 19.4. If we apply these considerations to castes among Mohammedans, Sikhs and Christians on the one hand, and to castes among Hindus on the other, you will find that caste among non-Hindus is fundamentally different from caste among Hindus. First, the ties which consciously make the Hindus hold together are non-existent, while among non-Hindus, there are many that hold them together. The strength of a society depends upon the presence of points of contact, possibilities of interaction between different groups which exist in it. These are what Carlyle calls organic filaments, that is, the elastic threads which help to bring the disintegrating elements together and to reunite them. There is no integrating force among the Hindus to counteract the disintegration caused by caste, while among the non-Hindus, there are plenty of these organic filaments which bind them together. 19.5. Again, it must be borne in mind that although there are castes among non-Hindus, as there are among Hindus, caste has not the same social significance for non-Hindus as it has for Hindus. Ask a Mohammedan or a Sikh who he is. He tells you that he is a Mohammedan or a Sikh, as the case may be. He does not tell you his caste, although he has one, and you are satisfied with his answer. When he tells you that he is a Muslim, you do not proceed to ask him whether he is a Shia or a Sunni, Sheikh or Sayyid, Khatik or Pinjari. When he tells you he is a Sikh, you do not ask him whether he is a Jat or Roda, Mazbi or Ramdasi, but you are not satisfied if a person tells you that he is a Hindu. You feel bound to inquire into his caste. Why? Because so essential is caste in the case of a Hindu that without knowing it, you do not feel sure what sort of a being he is. 19.6. That caste has not the same social significance among non-Hindus as it has among Hindus is clear, if you take into consideration the consequences which follow breach of caste. There may be castes among Sikhs and Mohammedans, but the Sikhs and the Mohammedans will not outcast a Sikh or a Mohammedan if he broke his caste. Indeed, the very idea of excommunication is foreign to the Sikhs and the Mohammedans. But with the Hindus, the case is entirely different. A Hindu is sure to be outcasted if he broke caste. This shows the difference in the social significance of caste to Hindus and non-Hindus. This is the second point of difference. 19.7. But there is also a third and a more important one. Caste among the non-Hindus has no religious consecration. But among the Hindus, most decidedly it has. Among the non-Hindus, caste is only a practice, not a sacred institution. They did not originate it. With them, it is only a survival mechanism. They do not regard caste as a religious dogma. Religion compels the Hindus to treat isolation and segregation of castes as a virtue. Religion does not compel the non-Hindus to take the same attitudes towards caste. If Hindus wish to break caste, their religion will come in their way. But it will not be so in the case of non-Hindus. It is, therefore, a dangerous delusion to take comfort in the mere existence of caste among non-Hindus without caring to know what place caste occupies in their life and whether there are other organic filaments which subordinate the feeling of caste to the feeling of community. The sooner the Hindus are cured of this delusion, the better. 19.8. The other set denies that caste presents any problem at all for the Hindus to consider. Such Hindus seek comfort in the view that the Hindus have survived and take this as a proof of their fitness to survive. This point of view is well expressed by Professor S. Radhakrishnan in his Hindu View of Life. Referring to Hinduism, he says, "The civilization itself has not been a short-lived one. Its historic records date back to over 4,000 years, and even then, it had reached a stage of civilization which has continued its unbroken, though at times slow and static, course until the present day. It has stood the stress and strain of more than 4 or 5 millenniums of spiritual thought and experience. Though peoples of different races and cultures have been pouring into India from the dawn of history, Hinduism has been able to maintain its supremacy, and even the proselytizing creeds backed by political power have not been able to coerce the large majority of Hindus to their views. The Hindu culture possesses some vitality which seems to be denied to some other more forceful currents. It is no more necessary to dissect Hinduism than to open a tree to see whether the sap still runs." The name of Professor Radhakrishnan is big enough to invest with profundity whatever he says and impress the minds of his readers. But I must not hesitate to speak out my mind, for I fear that his statement may become the basis of a vicious argument that the fact of survival is proof of fitness to survive. 19.9. It seems to me that the question is not whether a community lives or dies. The question is on what plane does it live? There are different modes of survival, but not all are equally honorable. For an individual as well as for a society, there is a gulf between merely living and living worthily. To fight in a battle and to live in glory is one mode. To beat a retreat, to surrender, and to live the life of a captive is also a mode of survival. It is useless for a Hindu to take comfort in the fact that he and his people have survived. What he must consider is, what is the quality of their survival? If he does that, I am sure he will cease to take pride in the mere fact of survival. A Hindu's life has been a life of continuous defeat, and what appears to him to be life everlasting is not living everlastingly, but is really a life which is perishing everlastingly. It is a mode of survival of which every right-minded Hindu who is not afraid to own up to the truth will feel ashamed. 20. 20.1. There is no doubt, in my opinion, that unless you change your social order, you can achieve little by way of progress. You cannot mobilize the community either for defense or for offense. You cannot build anything on the foundations of caste. You cannot build up a nation. You cannot build up a morality. Anything that you will build on the foundations of caste will crack and will never be a whole. 20.2. The only question that remains to be considered is how to bring about the reform of the Hindu social order, how to abolish caste. This is a question of supreme importance. There is a view that in the reform of caste, the first step to take is to abolish subcastes. This view is based upon the supposition that there is a greater similarity in manners and status between subcastes than there is between castes. I think this is an erroneous supposition. The Brahmins of northern and central India are socially of lower grade as compared with the Brahmins of the Deccan and southern India. The former are only cooks and water carriers, while the latter occupy a high social position. On the other hand, in northern India, the Vaishyas and Kayasthas are intellectually and socially on a par with the Brahmins of the Deccan and southern India. 20.3. Again, in the matter of food, there is no similarity between the Brahmins of the Deccan and southern India, who are vegetarians, and the Brahmins of Kashmir and Bengal, who are non-vegetarians. On the other hand, the Brahmins of the Deccan and southern India have more in common, so far as food is concerned, with such non-Brahmins as the Gujaratis, Marwadis, Baniyas and Jains. 20.4. There is no doubt that from the standpoint of making the transition from one caste to another easy, the fusion of the Kayasthas of northern India and the other non-Brahmins of southern India with the non-Brahmins of the Deccan and the Dravidian country is more practicable than the fusion of the Brahmins of the south with the Brahmins of the north. But assuming that the fusion of subcastes is possible, what guarantee is there that the abolition of subcastes will necessarily lead to the abolition of castes? On the contrary, it may happen that the process may stop with the abolition of subcastes. In that case, the abolition of subcastes will only help to strengthen the castes and make them more powerful and therefore more mischievous. This remedy is therefore neither practicable nor effective and may easily prove to be a wrong remedy. 20.5. Another plan of action for the abolition of caste is to begin with intercaste dinners. This also, in my opinion, is an inadequate remedy. There are many castes which allow interdining, but it is a common experience that interdining has not succeeded in killing the spirit of caste and the consciousness of caste. I am convinced that the real remedy is intermarriage. Fusion of blood can alone create the feeling of being kith and kin, and unless this feeling of kinship, of being kindred, becomes paramount, the separatist feeling, the feeling of being aliens created by caste, will not vanish. Among the Hindus, intermarriage must necessarily be a factor of greater force in social life than it need be in the life of the non-Hindus. Where society is already well knit by other ties, marriage is an ordinary incident of life. But where society is cut asunder, marriage as a binding force becomes a matter of urgent necessity. The real remedy for breaking caste is intermarriage. Nothing else will serve as the solvent of caste. 20.6. Your Jat Paat Todak Mandal has adopted this line of attack. It is a direct and frontal attack, and I congratulate you upon a correct diagnosis and more upon your having shown the courage to tell the Hindus what is really wrong with them. Political tyranny is nothing compared to social tyranny, and a reformer who defies society is a much more courageous man than a politician who defies the government. You are right in holding that caste will cease to be an operative force only when interdining and intermarriage have become matters of common course. You have located the source of the disease. 20.7. But is your prescription the right prescription for the disease? Ask yourself this question. Why is it that a large majority of Hindus do not interdine and do not intermarry? Why is it that your cause is not popular? 20.8. There can only be one answer to this question, and it is that interdining and intermarriage are repugnant to the beliefs and dogmas which the Hindus regard as sacred. Caste is not a physical object like a wall of bricks or a line of barbed wire which prevents the Hindus from commingling and which has, therefore, to be pulled down. Caste is a notion. It is a state of mind. The destruction of caste does not, therefore, mean the destruction of a physical barrier. It means a notional change. 20.9. Caste may be bad. Caste may lead to conduct so gross as to be called man's inhumanity to man. All the same, it must be recognized that the Hindus observe caste not because they are inhuman or wrong-headed. They observe caste because they are deeply religious. People are not wrong in observing caste. In my view, what is wrong is their religion, which has inculcated this notion of caste. If this is correct, then obviously the enemy you must grapple with is not the people who observe caste, but the Shastras, which teach them this religion of caste. Criticizing and ridiculing people for not interdining or intermarrying, or occasionally holding intercaste dinners and celebrating intercaste marriages, is a futile method of achieving the desired end. The real remedy is to destroy the belief in the sanctity of the Shastras. 20.10. How do you expect to succeed if you allow the Shastras to continue to mold the beliefs and opinions of the people? Not to question the authority of the Shastras, to permit the people to believe in their sanctity and their sanctions, and then to blame the people and to criticize them for their acts as being irrational and inhuman, is an incongruous way of carrying on social reform. Reformers working for the removal of untouchability, including Mahatma Gandhi, do not seem to realize that the acts of the people are merely the results of their beliefs inculcated in their minds by the Shastras, and that people will not change their conduct until they cease to believe in the sanctity of the Shastras on which their conduct is founded. 20.11. No wonder that such efforts have not produced any results. You also seem to be erring in the same way as the reformers working in the cause of removing untouchability. To agitate for and to organize intercaste dinners and intercaste marriage is like forced feeding brought about by artificial means. Make every man and woman free from the thraldom of the Shastras. Cleanse their minds of the pernicious notions founded on the Shastras, and he or she will interdine and intermarry without your telling him or her to do so. 20.12. It is no use seeking refuge in quibbles. It is no use telling people that the Shastras do not say what they are believed to say, if they are grammatically read or logically interpreted. What matters is how the Shastras have been understood by the people. You must take the stand that Buddha took. You must take the stand which Guru Nanak took. You must not only discard the Shastras, you must deny their authority, as did Buddha and Nanak. You must have courage to tell the Hindus that what is wrong with them is their religion, the religion which has produced in them this notion of the sacredness of caste. Will you show that courage? 20.1. There is no doubt, in my opinion, that unless you change your social order, you can achieve little by way of progress. You cannot mobilize the community either for defense or for offense. You cannot build anything on the foundations of caste. You cannot build up a nation, you cannot build up a morality. Anything that you will build on the foundations of caste will crack and will never be a whole. 20.2. The only question that remains to be considered is how to bring about the reform of the Hindu social order, how to abolish caste. This is a question of supreme importance. There is a view that in the reform of caste, the first step to take is to abolish subcastes. This view is based upon the supposition that there is a greater similarity in manners and status between subcastes than there is between castes. I think this is an erroneous supposition. The Brahmins of northern and central India are socially of lower grade as compared with the Brahmins of the Deccan and southern India. The former are only cooks and water carriers, while the latter occupy a high social position. On the other hand, in northern India, the Vaishyas and Kayasthas are intellectually and socially on a par with the Brahmins of the Deccan and southern India. 20.3. Again, in the matter of food, there is no similarity between the Brahmins of the Deccan and southern India, who are vegetarians, and the Brahmins of Kashmir and Bengal, who are non-vegetarians. On the other hand, the Brahmins of the Deccan and southern India have more in common so far as food is concerned with such non-Brahmins as the Gujaratis, Marwadis, Baniyas and Jains. 20.4. There is no doubt that from the standpoint of making the transition from one caste to another easy, the fusion of the Kayasthas of northern India and the other non-Brahmins of southern India with the non-Brahmins of the Deccan and the Dravidian country is more practicable than the fusion of the Brahmins of the south with the Brahmins of the north. But assuming that the fusion of subcastes is possible, what guarantee is there that the abolition of subcastes will necessarily lead to the abolition of castes? On the contrary, it may happen that the process may stop with the abolition of subcastes. In that case, the abolition of subcastes will only help to strengthen the castes and make them more powerful and therefore more mischievous. This remedy is therefore neither practicable nor effective and may easily prove to be a wrong remedy. 20.5. Another plan of action for the abolition of caste is to begin with intercaste dinners. This also, in my opinion, is an inadequate remedy. There are many castes which allow interdining, but it is a common experience that interdining has not succeeded in killing the spirit of caste and the consciousness of caste. I am convinced that the real remedy is intermarriage. Fusion of blood can alone create the feeling of being kith and kin, and unless this feeling of kinship, of being kindred, becomes paramount, the separatist feeling, the feeling of being aliens created by caste, will not vanish. Among the Hindus, intermarriage must necessarily be a factor of greater force in social life than it need be in the life of the non-Hindus. Where society is already well knit by other ties, marriage is an ordinary incident of life. But where society is cut asunder, marriage as a binding force becomes a matter of urgent necessity. The real remedy for breaking caste is intermarriage. Nothing else will serve as the solvent of caste. 20.6. Your Jat Paat Todak Mandal has adopted this line of attack. It is a direct and frontal attack, and I congratulate you upon a correct diagnosis and more upon your having shown the courage to tell the Hindus what is really wrong with them. Political tyranny is nothing compared to social tyranny, and a reformer who defies society is a much more courageous man than a politician who defies the government. You are right in holding that caste will cease to be an operative force only when interdining and intermarriage have become matters of common course. You have located the source of the disease. 20.7. But is your prescription the right prescription for the disease? Ask yourself this question. Why is it that a large majority of Hindus do not interdine and do not intermarry? Why is it that your cause is not popular? 20.8. There can only be one answer to this question, and it is that interdining and intermarriage are repugnant to the beliefs and dogmas which the Hindus regard as sacred. Caste is not a physical object like a wall of bricks or a line of barbed wire which prevents the Hindus from commingling and which has, therefore, to be pulled down. Caste is a notion. It is a state of mind. The destruction of caste does not, therefore, mean the destruction of a physical barrier. It means a notional change. 20.9. Caste may be bad. Caste may lead to conduct so gross as to be called man's inhumanity to man. All the same, it must be recognized that the Hindus observe caste not because they are inhuman or wrong-headed. They observe caste because they are deeply religious. People are not wrong in observing caste. In my view, what is wrong is their religion, which has inculcated this notion of caste. If this is correct, then obviously the enemy you must grapple with is not the people who observe caste, but the Shastras, which teach them this religion of caste. Criticizing and ridiculing people for not interdining or intermarrying, or occasionally holding intercaste dinners and celebrating intercaste marriages is a futile method of achieving the desired end. The real remedy is to destroy the belief in the sanctity of the Shastras. 20.10. How do you expect to succeed if you allow the Shastras to continue to mold the beliefs and opinions of the people? Not to question the authority of the Shastras, to permit the people to believe in their sanctity and their sanctions, and then to blame the people and to criticize them for their acts as being irrational and inhuman, is an incongruous way of carrying on social reform. Reformers working for the removal of untouchability, including Mahatma Gandhi, do not seem to realize that the acts of the people are merely the results of their beliefs inculcated in their minds by the Shastras, and that people will not change their conduct until they cease to believe in the sanctity of the Shastras on which their conduct is founded. 20.11. No wonder that such efforts have not produced any results. You also seem to be erring in the same way as the reformers working in the cause of removing untouchability. To agitate for and to organize intercaste dinners and intercaste marriage is like forced feeding brought about by artificial means. Make every man and woman free from the thraldom of the Shastras. Cleanse their minds of the pernicious notions founded on the Shastras, and he or she will interdine and intermarry without your telling him or her to do so. 20.12. It is no use seeking refuge in quibbles. It is no use telling people that the Shastras do not say what they are believed to say, if they are grammatically read or logically interpreted. What matters is how the Shastras have been understood by the people. You must take the stand that Buddha took. You must take the stand which Guru Nanak took. You must not only discard the Shastras, you must deny their authority, as did Buddha and Nanak. You must have courage to tell the Hindus that what is wrong with them is their religion. The religion which has produced in them this notion of the sacredness of caste. Will you show that courage? 21. 21.1. What are your chances of success? Social reforms fall into different species. There is a species of reform which does not relate to the religious notions of a people, but is purely secular in character. There is also a species of reform which relates to the religious notions of a people. Of such a species of reform, there are two varieties. In one, the reform accords with the principles of the religion and merely invites people who have departed from it to revert to them and to follow them. 21.2. The second is a reform which not only touches the religious principles, but is diametrically opposed to those principles and invites people to depart from and to discard their authority and to act contrary to those principles. Caste is the natural outcome of certain religious beliefs which have the sanction of the Shastras, which are believed to contain the command of divinely inspired sages who were endowed with a supernatural wisdom and whose commands, therefore, cannot be disobeyed without committing a sin. 21.3. The destruction of caste is a reform which falls under the third category. To ask people to give up caste is to ask them to go contrary to their fundamental religious notions. It is obvious that the first and second species of reform are easy. But the third is a stupendous task, well nigh impossible. The Hindus hold to the sacredness of the social order. Caste has a divine basis. You must therefore destroy the sacredness and divinity with which caste has become invested. In the last analysis, this means you must destroy the authority of the Shastras and the Vedas. 21.4. I have emphasized this question of the ways and means of destroying caste because I think that knowing the proper ways and means is more important than knowing the ideal. If you do not know the real ways and means, all your shots are sure to be misfired. If my analysis is correct, then your task is Herculean. You alone can say whether you are capable of achieving it. 21.5. Speaking for myself, I see the task to be well nigh impossible. Perhaps you would like to know why I think so. Out of the many reasons which have led me to take this view, I will mention some which I regard as most important. One of these reasons is the attitude of hostility which the Brahmins have shown towards this question. The Brahmins form the vanguard of the movement for political reform, and in some cases also of economic reform. But they are not to be found, even as camp followers, in the army raised to break down the barricades of caste. Is there any hope of the Brahmins ever taking up a lead in the future in this matter? I say no. 21.6. You may ask why. You may argue that there is no reason why Brahmins should continue to shun social reform. You may argue that the Brahmins know that the bane of Hindu society is caste, and as an enlightened class, they could not be expected to be indifferent to its consequences. You may argue that there are secular Brahmins and priestly Brahmins, and if the latter do not take up the cudgels on behalf of those who want to break caste, the former will. 21.7. All this, of course, sounds very plausible. But in all this, it is forgotten that the breakup of the caste system is bound to adversely affect the Brahmin caste. Having regard to this, is it reasonable to expect that the Brahmins will ever consent to lead a movement, the ultimate result of which is to destroy the power and prestige of the Brahmin caste? Is it reasonable to expect the secular Brahmins to take part in a movement directed against the priestly Brahmins? In my judgment, it is useless to make a distinction between the secular Brahmins and the priestly Brahmins. Both are kith and kin. They are two arms of the same body, and one is bound to fight for the existence of the other. 21.8. In this connection, I am reminded of some very pregnant remarks made by Professor Dicey in his English Constitution. Speaking of the actual limitation on the legislative supremacy of Parliament, Dicey says, "The actual exercise of authority by any sovereign whatever, and notably by Parliament, is bounded or controlled by two limitations. Of these, the one is an external, the other is an internal limitation. The external limit to the real power of a sovereign consists in the possibility or certainty that his subjects, or a large number of them, will disobey or resist his laws." End of quotation. The internal limit to the exercise of sovereignty arises from the nature of the sovereign power itself. Even a despot exercises his powers in accordance with his character, which is itself molded by the circumstances under which he lives, including under that head the moral feelings of the time and the society to which he belongs. The Sultan could not, if he would, change the religion of the Mohammedan world, but even if he could do so, it is in the very highest degree improbable that the head of Mohammedanism should wish to overthrow the religion of Muhammad. The internal check on the exercise of the Sultan's power is at least as strong as the external limitation. People sometimes ask the idle question, why the Pope does not introduce this or that reform? The true answer is that a revolutionist is not the kind of man who becomes a Pope, and that the man who becomes a Pope has no wish to be a revolutionist. 21.9. I think these remarks apply equally to the Brahmins of India, and one can say with equal truth that if a man who becomes a Pope has no wish to become a revolutionary, a man who is born a Brahmin has much less desire to become a revolutionary. Indeed, to expect a Brahmin to be a revolutionary in matters of social reform is as idle as to expect the British Parliament, as was said by Leslie Stephen, to pass an act requiring all blue-eyed babies to be murdered. 21.10. Some of you will say that it is a matter of small concern whether the Brahmins come forward to lead the movement against caste or whether they do not. To take this view is, in my judgment, to ignore the part played by the intellectual class in the community. Whether you accept the theory of the great man as the maker of history or whether you do not, this much you will have to concede, that in every country, the intellectual class is the most influential class, if not the governing class. The intellectual class is the class which can foresee. It is the class which can advise and give the lead. In no country does the mass of the people live the life of intelligent thought and action. It is largely imitative and follows the intellectual class. 21.11. There is no exaggeration in saying that the entire destiny of a country depends upon its intellectual class. If the intellectual class is honest, independent, and disinterested, it can be trusted to take the initiative and give a proper lead when a crisis arises. It is true that intellect by itself is no virtue. It is only a means, and the use of means depends upon the ends which an intellectual person pursues. An intellectual man can be a good man, but he can easily be a rogue. Similarly, an intellectual class may be a band of high-souled persons ready to help, ready to emancipate erring humanity. Or it may easily be a gang of crooks, or a body of advocates for a narrow clique from which it draws its support. 21.12. You may think it a pity that the intellectual class in India is simply another name for the Brahmin caste. You may regret that the two are one, that the existence of the intellectual class should be bound up with one single caste, that this intellectual class should share the interest and the aspirations of that Brahmin caste, which has regarded itself as the custodian of the interest of that caste, rather than of the interests of the country. All this may be very regrettable, but the fact remains that the Brahmins form the intellectual class of the Hindus. It is not only an intellectual class, but it is a class which is held in great reverence
by the rest